Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah daf Samachet. We're going to get started with this story, actually two stories, starting from the very bottom of Samach Dalet Amud Bet. Rav Yehuda shadro le korbana lavidrana biyom edam. Rav Yehuda sends a gift to Avidrana, who Rashi tells us is a non-Jew, on their holidays. Now, we already learned from the very first Mishnah that you're not allowed to do that. So Amal, he said, Yadanabe de lo palach lavodah zarah. I know he doesn't worship idols, and therefore there's no issue. There's no concern that this Avidrana is going to go and thank their gods. Amalei Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, wait a minute, the Hatanya, now we're going to understand why we got here, from the Ger Toshav of yesterday. He quotes in the Bright we saw before. Ezehu Ger Toshav, kol shekibel alav b'fnei shlosha chaverim, shelo la'avod avodah zarah. Right? What is a Ger Toshav? It's anyone who accepts upon himself, in front or herself, in front of three people, three Jews, like a Beit Din, not to worship idols. Now, comes Rav Yosef and says, this Avidrana, maybe he doesn't worship idols, but he didn't do some sort of declaration in front of three rabbis or three judges or three people, three Jews, to say, I'm not going to worship idols. To which, and Rav Yosef assumes that that source must be referring to our halacha, that that in order to consider them not an idol worshiper, they need to have taken on this declaration. To which Rav Yehuda says, no, that's not what that source was talking about. Kitanya hahi lahachayoto. Our responsibility to help save someone's life is specifically for Jewish people. And that person is not considered a Jewish person that or not considered a person that we require to save unless they've accepted it in front of three people. Okay, that's an issue in and of itself. Why we're not obligated to save a life of anybody, I'm going to put that issue aside for right now because it's not our central topic. We have touched on it in other places. To which the Gemara asks, but wait, didn't Rabbi Bar Chana say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ger Toshav shavru alav 12 chodesh v'lo mal, harei hu kimin shebeumot? But we raise another issue with what Rabbi Yehuda did, because the Gemara says, didn't Rabbi Bar Chana say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that if you have a Ger Toshav who doesn't do a Brit Milah, doesn't decide, in other words, right now, this statement sounds like Ger Toshav is actually not an independent thing of someone who decides to, like we saw yesterday, keep the 7 Noachide laws, or accept they're not going to worship idols, or we saw the three opinions. But what he's saying is it's a stepping stone to converting. And if you have a Ger Toshav that 12 months passed and they didn't circumcise themselves, meaning they didn't become a full-fledged Jew, Harehu kimin shebaumot. They're the worst of the worst, really, because they're considered like a heretic in the other nations. Meaning not just that they're considered idol worshippers, but they're actually considered a heretic, which is the worst. So how do we explain that? And according to what you're saying, now what basically we understand right now is that Avidrana was a Ger Toshav, but he didn't convert, so he should be, and a year must have passed, so he must be the worst, a heretic. So how could you possibly give him a gift? To which the Gemara answers, Hatem kigon shekibel alav lamul v'lo mal. Just like the previous source. The Gemara answers here, or Rav Yehuda possibly answers, if they were directing the question at him, that source was talking about something more specific, not any Ger Toshav. That was a person who planned to convert and then didn't go ahead with it. Okay, so if you have someone who was in the conversion process and was planning to convert and then didn't circumcise within a year, then we're going to assume that they're a heretic, okay, that they're rejecting it completely. Now, obviously, anyone who knows about conversion knows that often it's more than a year-long process to convert. So it's possible that the question is, where are they starting the count from? Okay, from what point? Seems like from the point the person is ready to convert and then doesn't go ahead with the conversion. If a year passes, then we have an issue. Rava, the second story. This story is going to be a little bit different. It's going to start off very similar, but end off in a very different place. Rava amtile korban alabar shishach b'yom edam. So Rava brings a present, right? A korban, by the way, literally translates as sacrifice, but here means, or I would say literally means gift, really. And often we translate as sacrifice. Here, obviously, we're talking about a gift. He gave a gift to Bar Shishach on their holiday. Amal Yadanabe de lo palach lavodah zarah. He says, I know he doesn't worship idols. Azal eshkachei diyativ ad savarei bevrad. And Rav is in for a big surprise. He goes to give him the gift. And Bar Shishach is in the bathhouse. When he gets to the bathhouse, he sees him bathing in rose water. V'kaiman zonot arumot kameh. And there's naked prostitutes all around him. Okay, I'm trying to imagine Rava walking into this scene, right, and how shocked he must be. Amar le. So now Bar Shishach engages Rava in conversation. Do you have such a thing like this in your olam haba, in your world to come? In other words, what could be better than this? To which Rava answers, Amar le, didana difatmei mehai. What we have is better than what you have. Amar le, tfei mehai mihava. So Bar Shishach says, what could be better than this? Amar le, atun ik alaychu emata de malchuta. He says, Rava says to Bar Shishach, you have the king's fear, the fear of the king upon you. You're not a free person. Ana, and we, lo tahave alane emata de malchuta. When we get into olam haba, we're not going to be in fear of the king anymore. Okay, we're not going to be subjugated to the king in any way. Amar le, to which Bar Shishach answers, Ana mi amai emta de malchuta ikalai. Why do you think I'm scared of the king? I don't have any fear of the king upon me. Okay, and that was his response to Rava. Okay, we're seeing that, maybe he wasn't an idol worshiper, but it's clear here that he wasn't exactly the kind of person that Rava wanted to really be associating with. Number one, he had these naked women around him. Number two, he was kind of somewhat mocking Judaism by saying, oh, well, we clearly have it better. You can't possibly have any world to come that's better than what I have right now. And even what you suggested about Emat HaMalchut, I don't have that either. I'm not scared of the king. Now, story continues. Adi Yatve, while they're sitting, Ata'u Pristika Demalka. One of the king's henchmen come, and Amarle, Kum de Kabayalach Malka, get up, because the king is asking for you. Now remember, Bar Shishach is sitting, bathing in rose water with all these naked women around him, and the king calls him. So what happens? Obviously, Kinafik Basil, he gets up immediately and starts going to the king after he just said, I don't have the fear of the king upon me. Now, if he didn't have the fear of the king, he would obviously stay with those prostitutes. But he says, I don't have, Kinafik Basil. Now, as he was going out to the king and he realizes that Rava was right, because obviously if he had to get up right now, because the king was calling, he obviously does have the fear of the king upon him. And he was in awe of Rava because of what Rava said, because Rava really understood him better than he understood himself. And he says, Eina debaya lemechse l'chu bishata tifka. He says, the eye that wants to do anything bad to you, Rava, his eye will explode, okay, or pop out. Okay, basically he's cursing anyone who wants to do anything bad to Rava, because he's amazed by Rava and his brilliance, or also possibly his religion. Right? So now, the next thing that happens is, Amar le Rava, Amen. So Rava answers Amen. And then, Paka Ene de Bar Shishach. Right? And the story is coming back and saying, right, Bar Shishach's eye popped out, because Bar Shishach, it turns out, again, if we go back to that he was somewhat mocking Rava earlier, he ends up being those, now even though he didn't really wish bad for Rava, but he also didn't trust him enough and was a little bit mocking him before, and the punishment goes right straight onto Bar Shishach. Interesting story. Okay, what they're trying to tell us, seems like they're trying to tell us to be wary of, right? Rav Yehuda did it, got away with it, even though also there was some critique about it, but he did have answers to it. Rava, in the end, seems like there's a bit of an issue with him trying to think that Bar Shishach wasn't an idol worshiper. Again, you might distinguish between idol worship and other things, but the story seems to be critiquing a little bit what Rava did. So now we're going to have some suggestions what Rava could have answered to Bar Shishach instead of saying, you have the fear of the king upon you, and we won't have that. He could have answered him something that maybe Bar Shishach would have related to a little better. Amar Papi, Ibaya leila meimra le mehai krai. Should have brought this pasuk. Beno malachim bi'karutecha, nitzvah shegal yiminecha beketem ofil. This is a pasuk describing that the daughters of the kings are going to be respecting you, and in other words, and the queens will be wearing ophir, and they will be with you. Basically, he should have said, you have these prostitutes who are, nobodies, but we have the daughters of kings serving us, and that's what we have in Olam Haba. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, I think that would have been a good response because it would have spoken more directly, and Bar Shishak wouldn't have been dismissive. He would have understood right away the difference. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Ibayla l'meimar mehacha, ayin lo ra'ata Elohim zulatcha yaseh l'mechakeh lo. Right? Nobody has even seen what God will do for those who beseech Him, those who cling to God. Right? No one. You think this is amazing. You haven't even seen what's yet to come. And that would have also quieted him, because what can he argue against that? Whereas in this case, Bar Shishak had a retort. Now it happens he was wrong and proven wrong, but he could have not been proven wrong, and these would have been good retorts as well. We're back to the Mishnah. If you remember, the Mishnah had two basic cases. The first case was you hire someone to do work for you, and then if you hire them to move your yeh nesach, they can't benefit from the salary. But if you hire them to do a different job, and within that you ask them to move the yeh nesach, then they can do that. To which the Gemara says, questions, even if it wasn't, they weren't asked to move the wine at the end of the day, after they had already completed their work. Now, why is the Gemara asking this? Because it's going to contradict this other source. Right? It makes it sound in the Mishnah that if any time during the day, okay, I'm working for you, or I'm working for an idolater, doing all sorts of jobs, or doing a particular job, and they ask me to move a yeh nesach because that's not what I'm getting paid for. It sounded like it doesn't matter. Any time of day they can ask me, I can still make that salary and benefit from it. But the Gemara brings a bright to Rimini. Hasocheret hapoel. Okay, same idea. Socheret hapoel, you hire a worker. Uli, or an idolater hires a worker. Uli tute erev, and at the end of the day, after you had already completed your work, Amar le lo he'avir li chavit shel yeh nesach mimakom lemakom scharo mutal. So if you ask at the end of the day, after they've already either gotten paid or at least finished all the work for which they were supposed to get paid, and then they ask you to do one other job, you can benefit from the salary of that entire day, because the job they ask you to do, even if they would pay you for it, for the yeh nesach job, it's considered independent of the day's work. If you were supposed to make $100 a day, and then they asked you to do something for another $5, that $5 is independent of the 100. So the 5, obviously, you can't benefit from, but the 100 you could. So according to this, Tama damar leili tute erev in kule yom alo. But it sounds like because you asked at the end of the day when you had already gotten paid, and then the moving the yeh nesach isn't part of that one salary of $100. But if they ask you to move it during the day, it sounds like you can't, because within that $100, you did some work that's worth something, and it was one salary that you're getting, and it's all mixed in. So, right? Sounds like kule yom alo. It sounds like, right? Tamad amar leili tute erev. That's why it works, because you said at the end of the day. But kule yom, but the rest of the day, lo. It shouldn't work. So how does Abaye resolve this? Amar Abaye. We're going to have Abaye and Ravi each resolving in a different way. Abaye just changes the Mishnah. It says the Mishnah is talking about li tute erev also. And that resolves the problem. Okay, even though the Mishnah didn't say it, actually if you would take upon yourself to do something during the day for the, and they asked you to move their yeh nesach in the middle of the day, and the salary goes on that as well, it's included in that. Rava Amar Lokash, he gives a different response, and he says the Braita here and the Mishnah are talking about two different scenarios. Hada Amarle, ha'avir li mea chaviyot b'mea prutot. If you said, move for me 100 barrels, if the idolater said, move for me 100 barrels for 100 prutot, and then one of the barrels happens to be yeh nesach, that's going to be a problem. And that's when the Braita says, only if you said li tute erev, if you already moved your 100 that you're getting paid 100 prutot for, and then they ask you, can you move one more for a pruta? Then if you move that one, so you can't benefit from that salary, but the 100 is totally protected. And that's why it only works li tute erev, because if it's during the day and they say move 100 and one of those 100 is yeh nesach, of course you can't benefit from the salary, because the 100 pruto goes on everything, and included in that everything is the yeh nesach. And the Mishnah is Hada Amarle Haverli Chavit bepruta. If you say, I want you to move 100 barrels for me, each barrel for a pruta, then each barrel is considered independent. So if you get paid your 100 pruta for 100 barrels and one of them is yeh nesach, it's fine. You just have to not keep one pruta. One pruta you can't benefit from, but the rest of the salary is independent because the salary was given to you on a per barrel basis. So each pruta is judged independently. And then even if in the middle of the day, you can still benefit from the rest of the salary, just not the salary you got for moving the Nesach barrel. But now the Gemara asks, the Gemara now is going to bring a Braita to prove. This Vahatanya is actually a proof. Usually it's a difficulty, but in this case it's a proof. Ha-socher et ha'pov omer lo ha'aver li 100 chaviyot b'100 prutot v'nimtzeit chavit shel yenesach benehem scharo asur. If you say 100 for 100 prutot and one is yenesach, they're all forbidden. This is exactly proving the distinction Rava just made. Right, the whole salary is forbidden. Chavit b'pruta, v'nimtzei chavit shel yenesach benehem scharo mutar. But if each one was for a pruta, again, you can benefit from that salary. Only one of the pruta you can't, but the rest of them you can. Okay, so that was a question, a difficulty on our Mishnah. 2 resolutions, Abai and Rava, and then we further prove Rava's from a Braita. Next case in the Mishnah. Hasocheret hachamor lavi aleh yenesach scharo asur. And when we read the Mishnah, we said, you hire a donkey to carry yenesach. Obviously, the rent, if you hire out a donkey, you rent out this donkey, the rent money is forbidden because you rented it to someone to move yenesach. So what we said when we learned the Mishnah, there's basically 4 cases, right? 2 main cases, and each one has 2 parts to it. But they're basically repetitive, right? It's the same case. It's just one is hiring a worker and one is renting a donkey. So hatu lamali, why do we need both cases? It's really one and the same. Hainu reisha, it's the same thing as the first case. Seifa itzrichale, we needed it for the second part of the second case. Schara leishev aleha, so why do we need this? We needed it to tell you that if you hired a donkey to sit on it, even though the idolater, right, an idolater rented a donkey to ride on it. Now, even though he puts his bottle of wine on there, and we're going to see, and that was expected, really, you can still benefit from the salary, right, from the rental fee. Why? Is that because when I rent out my donkey to someone to ride on it, I don't expect him to put his wine on there, right? That's the assumption, because then it's not included in the price, the wine, the fact that he's carrying wine on the donkey. But that's not really true, because Rumini, this contradicts the following source. We're now going to talk about a law where if I rent out a donkey, why did I rent the donkey? To carry me, carry my load, whatever it must be. We're going to see. Let's say I'm renting a donkey to take me from one place to another. Now, a rental of a donkey comes with a donkey rider, okay, someone who rides the donkey. So we each have rights. Now, we're going I'm taking, let's say, a taxi to somewhere. Now, I have rights to put, let's say I take a taxi, so I can put a suitcase in the baggage area, right? What if the suitcase is full of the driver's stuff? And there's no room for my suitcase, right? They pick me up at the airport and there's no room for my suitcase. I could claim, right? That's not fair. I have rights to the suitcase, right? To the luggage area, to the trunk. So that's really what we're talking about here. So what is the person who rented it allowed to put? Ksuto, their clothes, leginato, their wine. Now you see, right, their flask of wine. Now you see that they have a right to put their flask of wine. Umazonotav, and the food, shel oto aderech, for the whole way. However long it's going to take me to get there, I can bring that much stuff. If I try to bring more than that, though, the donkey rider could say, hey, that's too much. My donkey can't handle that much, and you have to take it off. Chamal, well, also, by the way, the donkey rider gets to put some stuff on the donkey because they get the barley and the hay for the animal to eat, and food for themselves, but this time only for one day. Okay, so the one who rented it gets the whole ride. The donkey rider only gets for that day. We're going to have to understand the difference in a few minutes, but the first question is, right, if the donkey rider tries to put on too much, the renter could say, hey, you're making the load too heavy, it's going to take longer for the donkey to get there, and you can't do that. But what do you see? What's included really in the price? The fact that they get to bring their flask. So their flask seems to be part of the deal. So how could you say if they rented out a donkey to ride it somewhere that they're allowed to put their flask of yain nesach there? It sounds like it's built into the price of the rental. So Abaye answers this, and then once Abaye answers the difficulty, we're then going to go back and try to understand exactly the case and why the donkey rider gets only one day while the renter gets the whole trip. So Amar Abaye, Nihidalagin, Dinahulo, Tuve. Now, there's two different things going on here. One is the renter has the rights to put their wine there. But mia ilo motivle. But what if he didn't put it there? Now, that doesn't mean it's included in the price of the salary. It just means it's his rights. But it's not included in the salary. How do we know? Because ilo motivle. What if he didn't put a flask of wine there? Mi amrinale nikeli igor deliginato. He can't say deduct me the price, right? I want you to deduct me some money because I'm not putting the wine there. So that resolves the problem. But now we want to understand the case. Hechidami, what's the case? If they're going through places on their journey where you can buy food every day, well, chamarnami la'akif, then the donkey rider could say, hey, don't load down your stuff because we'll buy food on the way. If there's nothing to buy along the way, so charnami lo la'akif, then the renter can't stop the donkey rider from bringing food for the entire trip. If there's nowhere to stop, then obviously they need food for the animal, food for themselves. So Amar Papa, it's a place where you can find food in each stop, but it's an effort. Now, the donkey rider, that's his job. So the donkey rider's used to, this is what they do. They go from place to place and they know how to find food, and we expect that the donkey rider will make the effort. But socher lavdar kilamitrachol. But the one who rented, it's not his typical way of going from place to place and finding food. So therefore, we don't make him make the effort, and we give him the whole ride. Whereas the donkey rider, who's used to doing this and it's expected, they're going to do that. They have to buy every day. Okay. Next case, Avodah Rav Acha bereid Rav Ika. There's a bit of a strange way we're introducing him. The father of Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika, which really means if it's the father of Rav Acha, who's the son of Rav Ika, then it's actually Rav Ika himself. Why it doesn't just say Rav Ika is a good question. Turning now to Amud Bet. Hava shafich lechamer lehu chamer lovdei kochavi. He would take wine from his barrels, it was kosher wine, and pour it into the jugs of the idolaters. Now the issue is going to be, or maybe there's no issue, we're going to see, but the potential issue is when he pours it into their jugs either, there's a machloket here, either have wine in their jugs, that got absorbed in and now is going to come out into the wine and turn it into yain nesach, because the wine that was absorbed we assume is yain nesach, or perhaps they have drops of wine left over from a different time they have wine in there. There was still a little wine in there, and as he pours the wine in, it mixes with the yain nesach and it forbids the whole thing. So he would do this though anyway, okay? And then after he would pour wine from his barrel into their jugs, he would then take them across to the other side of the river. And then besides that, they paid him for it. Okay, now the way it would usually work is you pay for a barrel of wine, you would get the barrel. But in this case, he poured the wine into their jugs. They didn't really need the barrel. So they gave him the barrel. They let him take it as salary, as like a tip kind of thing. Okay, so they left him with his barrel. See whether it's a tip or not. It sounds like it was part of the salary arrangement or maybe not arrangement, but in either way, we're going to get to the details soon when we start questioning. But they would give him the barrel and he would get to keep the barrel for himself. Atu Amar Leila Abaye. Now people said to Abaye, look at what Rav Ika is doing. Amar Lahu, ki katarech behetera katarech. In other words, what's the issue? The issue is, he's pouring in their wine. They now have yain nesach, and then he's taking them across the river. It sounds like he's benefiting from all this yain nesach stuff, even though the wine was fine to begin with. So Abaye says, no. This is all behetera. In other words, his wine is fine. He pours it in. It's already in their domain. That's their problem, not his problem. And the taking it across the river, we're going to have to see, because it sounds like he's getting paid for that also, and then he's really benefiting from yain nesach. So let's start trying to figure this out. So the first question they have, they're going to have two difficulties. One is he's taking them across the river once they already had yain nesach. And another problem is because he gets the barrel to keep for himself, harot sebekiyumo. he wants the Yain Nesach to remain in existence, because if it doesn't, if it starts to spill, let's say, and the jugs break and the wine spills, then he's going to have to take his barrel and give it back to them to save their wine. So it creates a scenario where he actually wants the Yain Nesach to exist and wants nothing to happen to it, none of the jugs to break, so that he doesn't have to give them back the barrel. So he's actually benefiting from the fact that the Yain Nesach is in existence. To which they answer, "Delo nitzteru zike." Right? Sorry, that's part of the question. "Delo nitzteru zike," because he doesn't want the barrel, the jugs to break. To which the Gemara answers, "Dematne bahadayu." No, it could be he made an arrangement from the beginning. He's going to get the barrels as salary, and they can't renege on that. In other words, they're his no matter what, even if the jugs were to break. Inami demaitu pristike badayu. Or alternatively, where they brought jugs with them, they had extra jugs in case that happened, and then he didn't need to worry about having to give his barrel back. Okay, second question. But wait, he's taking them across the river. So the katarach b'yisurei, right? He's now dealing with Yain Nesach. He's bringing it across the river. So they say, no, he wasn't really doing it himself. He told the person, the ferry rider, he told the person who rides the ferry from before to take these guys across the river. But he wasn't really directly benefiting from it, nor was he involved in it on his own. Or inami dinakite bekitre, or he gave them tied knots, which really means like a token. He gave him a token to get on the ferry. Again, it wasn't anymore his responsibility. He wasn't involved. He gave them kind of permission to go across and the money that they would need, but that was before he poured the jugs. So once he poured the jugs and they have Yain Nesach, they can now use the tokens and do what they want with them and cross the river. So what it means that he would take them across the river just meant he would help enable them to do it, but he wasn't actually the one doing it. And that's how this whole situation was permitted. Okay, new Mishnah. Yain Nesach shenafal al gabei anavim. If we have wine, Yain Nesach, that falls on grapes, yidichem, you rinse them, vehem mutarot. Okay, because the assumption is nothing gets into the grapes. However, im hayu mevukaot, if they were cracked, or some people say if the stem was off and then there's that little hole, and it could go down the hole, right? It could go through that hole, get inside the grape, there's no way to get it out, and therefore asurot. Some people have this next line in the Gemara, some people in the Mishnah, some people don't. Nafal al gabei te'inim or al gabei tmarim. The wine fell, though, on figs or dates, which do absorb the wine. Im yesh bahem benoten tam asul. If you can taste it, okay, if it gives taste to it and you can taste the wine, then, right, this is usually what we say shishim, 60 against, right? That already, if there's more than a ratio of 1 to 60, then you can taste it. If you can taste it, we're going to get into all this kashrus stuff soon, then it's forbidden. Umaaseh bebaitus benzonin. There was a case of baitus benzonin. Shevi grogro bisfina. He brought dried figs in a boat. Okay, by the way, the line that some people have, some people don't, is before the maaseh. So it's just the part about the figs and the dates. If they have benoten tam, it's forbidden. Some people have that in the Mishnah, some people don't. And then they say there was a case of baitus benzonin, who was a very wealthy person. He comes up actually in the stories of Tisha B'Av, of the destruction. Shevi grogro bisfina. He brought dried figs in a boat. V'nishtabra chavit shel Yain Nesach v'nafal agabehen. And while he was bringing these grogrot, these dried figs, a barrel of wine broke of Yain Nesach, and it fell all over them. V'sha'al hachachamim v'tirum. And the rabbis permitted this. Now this is strange, because if you have the line before, we just said figs are a problem, right? So we're going to have to figure this out. And if you don't have the line, then we'll have to see also what this is. Zaklal, this is the rule. Kol shebahana'ato b'noten tam asul. Kol she'en ma'ana'ato b'noten tam mutal. Kigom chomet shenafal gabei grisim. So here's the rule. Even though it fell on them, the issue is, if you benefit from the extra taste, then it's good. Then it's forbidden. It's not good. Right? Then it's forbidden. If you don't benefit from it, meaning what they're going to say is the wine on the dried figs made it taste bad, then it's permitted. Just like chometz that falls on grisim, right? If you have groats and the vinegar falls on top of it, right? That's a bad taste, and therefore it's not a problem. Even though the vinegar is from wine, could be Yain Nesach, we're not worried about it. Okay, so the Gemara immediately asks, which you might have already thought about, which is Maaseh Listol, that the story they brought seems to contradict what the halacha is, because again, either you have the line about the figs, and we just said the figs is a problem, and then the story happened where it fell on the figs and it was okay. Or if you don't have that line, still we can assume that dried figs are like the grapes that are mevukaot, that are cracked. So, and the wine gets absorbed, so it should also be a problem. So why did they say it was okay? So now they say, well, chisur mechasra v'achi katani. It's missing words, and this is the way it should read. Im noten tam lifgamhu mutal. In other words, if you remember the previous line, again, whether you have the second line or you don't have the second line, but let's go with the second line. It says it falls on figs or dates. If it gives it taste, then it's forbidden. What kind of taste, though? Only good taste. But if it gives tam lifgam, bad taste, it's mutal. And then we're going to bring a case. Now I want you to notice, if you go by this, figs means fresh figs. Wine on fresh figs is good. But on dried figs, it's bad. And that's why the story was different, because it was a story with dried figs where it actually gives bad taste. And then the Gemara continues to read the Mishnah the new way. And here's a case to prove it. And then they bring the case and says, here you have a case where it was bad, and it gave it bad taste, and therefore they permitted it. And then again, you would distinguish between dried figs and not dried figs. If you don't have that whole line, then basically you say, anavim that are cracked, it's a problem. But it's only, and then figs, dried figs, moist figs, any kind of figs would be a problem because they absorb. But it gives bad taste, and therefore, and then it's unclear whether it would also apply to moist figs or only for dried figs, but you don't have to then start making this distinction dry, not dry, etc., or not necessarily. Now we're going to have a case where there was a pile of wheat. The whole barrel, a barrel of yenesach falls upon it. Rava said, you can sell this to idolaters. You can't eat it, but you can sell it. So Rabba Bar Levi comes to Rava and says, what are you talking about? Look at this source. You're missing, there's some other issue going on here, which is what? Well, the Jews can't eat wheat that has yenesach on. Okay, maybe you can benefit, right? But you can't eat it if it has the wine yenesach mixed in. So, aren't we worried about some other issue, which is what? Well, if you have a baggage, avabo kilaim, you have a clothing, article of clothing, with one, let's say it's all wool, one strand of, one thread of flax in it. Harez aloyim keren. You can't sell it, lo ve'kochavim. V'lo yasena mirdat l'chamol, aval oseh oto tachrechin l'mei mitzvah. What we're going to see is you can't sell it to an idolater. You can't make it a saddle for your donkey, even though theoretically you can sit on kilayim. They forbade sitting on kilayim because maybe a thread will come out of there and you'll end up benefiting, right? We're worried about threads coming off, and then you'll end up wearing kilayim. But if there's only one thread, we're not really worried about that. However, still they said, you can't make it a mirdat l'chamor. The reason for this is we're worried. The whole issue is you don't see that there's shatnez in there because there's only one thread, one lone thread in there. Now, someone knows they put it in, so they know it's kilayim. But the issue is that if someone uses a saddle for their donkey, and then they're closed here, they might take part of the saddle off the donkey, cut a piece, use it as a patch, and they won't know that there's kilayim in there. Okay, the problem with the ovei kochavim we're going to see in a minute. The tachrich l'meit mitzvah, no one's going to ever use again because that is forbidden to benefit from. So if you use that for tachrichim for a meit mitzvah, that's fine. So now they say, lovei kochavim, my time. What's the reason, my time alo? Why can't you? Dilma ate l'zebuni l'Yisrael. Well, the issue is that since it's not noticeable and you sell it to an idolater, even though obviously, right, you can benefit from that sale, that's fine. But the problem is the idolater might go sell it to a Jew, and the Jew won't realize that it's shatnez. So they say, Hachanami ati l'zebuni l'Yisrael. So here also, you should be able to sell it. You should not be able to sell it to. You should not be able to sell it to an idolater because they might sell it to a Jew. The Jew won't notice that there was wine in the wheat. So Hadar Shari Lemitzchinu Ulamapinu Lizabnunu Lovdei Kochabim Shalo B'fnei Israel. So Rava said, you're right. And he said, but what I will let you do is grind it, make it into bread, and then sell it. Because as long as you don't sell it in front of a Jew, then there's no way that idolater is going to sell it to a Jew, because Jews don't buy bread from an akum. If you sell it to him in front of a Jew, then the Jew will see and the Jew will know that it's Jewish bread and they might buy it. Or tell someone else they could buy it. And that will be a problem. But if you sell it to them not in front of a Jew, then there's no way it'll ever get to a Jew, because the Jews can't buy pat akum, so they're not going to buy it anyway. And that was Rava's solution after they asked him this question. Tanan, but now we're going to bring up the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says, now we have a whole problem with the wheat in general. Now we're not back to what he did, but the problem is the wheat has the wine mixed in. Now, we say, though, it's right. It says here, if they're not mevukaot, it's not a problem. So what's the problem at all? Just rinse them, and there's no problem at all. Like, why are we even getting into these issues? Because wheat has that little crack in it. Because it has that crack in it, it's like mevukaot, and we assume the wine got absorbed. And that explains that story and why it was an issue, even though they resolved the issue, but it was an issue. Okay, what did we do today? Summary of our daf. We started with these two stories of people who gave gifts to idolaters on their holidays. One kind of seemed okay, even though we had some difficulties with it. The other one was a little bit difficult and ended in a bit of an interesting way about this discussion, got into all discussion between, what the pleasures are of this world versus the pleasures of the next world, and why it's better not to engage in prostitution, but yet save your share for the world to come. Then we went back to the Mishnah, and we did the whole thing about li tute erev, and we had two resolutions to the contradiction. Either really our Mishnah is li tute erev, or our Mishnah depends on how the arrangement was made, how you were going to get paid. Then we brought, why do you need the second two cases in the Mishnah? And the real reason is because of the very last part about the wine. And then they said, but why? Isn't the wine part of the deal? And then they said, no, it's not really part of the deal. Even though you're allowed to put your wine on the donkey, it's still not really considered part of the salary. And that's why it's okay. And then from there we got into this case of Rav Ika, who was pouring the wine into the jugs of the idolaters. And we had a whole question about why he could do that, and why it wasn't a case where he was actually benefiting from the idol worship. And then we ended with the Mishnah about Yenesach that falls on something. We distinguish between a case where it gets absorbed and a case where it doesn't get absorbed. If it didn't get absorbed, you can rinse it off. If it did get absorbed, you have a problem. And then you only have a problem, though, if it gives good flavor and not bad flavor. And then we ended with the story with the wheat and what he was able to do with it in order to not worry that it was going to end up back in the hands of a Jew. And with that, we compared it to the Kilayim case. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day.